But concerns are now growing that the euphoria around Prime Minister Abiy's changes are both masking and unearthing deeper problems inside of Ethiopia. A growing number of observers are starting to ask whether Prime Minister Abiy is simply moving too fast and whether the reforms he has initiated are generating instability and security and hostility in Ethiopia's ethnically based federal system of governance. One of the most worrying of concerns is the resentment and resistance that is building up against him and his government in Tigray province, the home of Ethiopia's once all-powerful security chief, Gachacha Asfa. Although 3 arrest warrants have been issued for Gachacha, he remains free and at large in Tigray, where he is being shielded and protected by the regional federal authority. Ethnic tensions are also bubbling up in other parts of the country. Concern about the pace of change and reform has led 2 journalists to recently raise the specter that the political situation in Ethiopia could slowly deteriorate and that the country could experience the same type of ethnic, regional, and religious fragmentation that tore Yugoslavia apart 2.5 decades ago.
Here's the United States, whether the president came from Massachusetts or the president came from Virginia. And I don't think it matters anymore, at least not quite so much in the United States. It still, I'm pretty sure, matters in Ethiopia. And I think that was the one thing that that really surprised me. Ethnicity was almost a zero-sum game. Everyone was an Ethiopian, but in their heart they were Tigrayan or Oromo or something else. And I think, when you look at it, ethnicity as a zero-sum game, if she gets something, that means I lose something, and that's not good for a country, obviously.
Now, the ethnic relationships, and these are just creating problems all over the country without much regard for what the central government is doing about it or can do about it, and this is the worrisome part. And they're not confined to just 1 or 2 areas. They're, unfortunately, happening throughout much of Ethiopia today.
And I suppose on top of that, I mean, in any country where there is multiple ethnic groups, there's the potential for ethnic clashes. But what is perhaps different in Ethiopia is that you also have an explicitly ethnically federal state. I mean, that's how it's set up in the constitution. So the big question, and I'm glad you mentioned what you just did, Ambassador Shin and Ambassador Busk, thank you for bringing up the rural nature of this, because I think that also feeds into this. But the big question here is, in some respect, do you think ethnic federalism is sustainable? Is this still a model that can work? And how does that look then in terms of all of the other prescriptions or actions that may be necessary to pursue? I mean, it's a big question, but it's an important one for the country.
Well, I think that's the fundamental question that Ethiopians need to address, because if they don't address the structure of their country, they can't have a successful election, they can't move the economy forward, security will continue to deteriorate. You already have 3% of the population who are internally displaced because of ethnic tensions, displacements. I personally think that a federal structure in a nation that has very different identities for its different components makes the most sense. Now, most opposition parties in Ethiopia, at least while I was there, their main complaint was this was a divide and rule tactic by the minority Tigrayans. It doesn't mean it's the ethnic federalism that I saw in operation in 2010 to 2013. At that point, the security forces, the security service, the secret service was all dominated by one ethnic group. They didn't like to hear that, but it was true.
Ambassador Booth, can I ask you to respond to this question about displacement? This is the current situation. Is it fair to say it's all the result of ethnic problems? Are there other causes to it? Are there other factors that explain it?
My understanding is the displacement that we've seen, the 3% of the population that I mentioned are now driven from their homes, really is, it's ethnic. But I've also been told that it's basically political leaders using the ethnic card to boost their own prestige and popularity. You get people riled up. I'm here to defend your interests against the other. And I think that's what we've seen in Ethiopia. I did hear when I was out there that the federal government's response was an edict that everybody should just go back to where they came from. I.e., if you were displaced, go back to where you were displaced from. That's nice to say, but very hard to actually implement. Why would people go back if they were driven out of their home? How would they feel safe there? If their home was burned, who was going to help them rebuild it? So, there's a conundrum there. And I don't think that this displacement issue is going to be settled until the broader political structural issues are settled in the country.
And perhaps I can ask you to continue from there about the views of the Ethiopians you interacted with on reform. So you were just there. How did they see it?
Well, I think it's a matter of, you see it from where you sit. If you're sitting up in Tigray, you think this is not particularly good development, that the country is degenerating into lawlessness and chaos, the economy is collapsing. If you're sitting in Oromia, you're breathing a bit of a sigh of relief that we now have our rightful place, we have some power. I think Prime Minister Abiy, as he was described, is still by far the most popular person in the country, but that popularity is beginning to wane the longer he's in charge. And I would say one of the real challenges that he faces is there are rising expectations in Ethiopia now. And one thing I do remember from Political Science 101 is that revolutions only occur in situations where there are rising expectations. So he has a lot of work to do if he's going to keep the country together, find that sweet spot of, what works governmentally wise, structurally, federal, centralized, what combination between government and party going forward. I think that's also a key structural issue that needs to be addressed. So again, it's, where you are, it depends on how you see the developments. Well, again, I'll go back to structural problem, and I talked about the political structural problem. There's also an economic structural problem that basically relates to the political system, which is you have too many state-owned enterprises, too much of the military engaged in things like MITEC, which now they're trying to break up. Massive projects like run by the Sugar Corporation, which were huge money losers. And the problem you have now is you can't just go and privatize things because what foreigner is going to come in to run something in Ethiopia to sell to Ethiopians for the most part? I'm not talking about manufacture in Ethiopia for export, but to deal with the local market. For example, telecom, which is primarily a local market. If you don't have any foreign exchange that they can then use to repatriate their profits. So I think structurally, one of the things the government needs to work on, and perhaps we can lend some ideas in that regard, is how to sort of begin to demonopolize, de-oligopolize the economy. Allow more competition, allow Ethiopian entrepreneurship to flourish. It used to really frustrate me when people would say, we need to teach the Ethiopians entrepreneurship. I said, have you ever been in Washington? Ethiopians are naturally entrepreneurial. So let's forget about teaching them how to do that. Let's give them the opportunity to do that. One of the things that strikes me, I visited a Turkish textile factory where they were manufacturing garments for export. And the biggest complaint was there's no supporting infrastructure. So I had to bring in some of my own workmen to do the type of building that I needed for my factory. Of course, I had to import all my machinery because none of it's manufactured locally. But I then had to create my own cardboard box manufacturing company because there was nothing locally that I could just buy from. I had to, in effect, set up my own bus company because there was no one that I could really rely upon to provide transportation for my workers. This all adds to the cost of production, and it deters foreign investors. You add to that the fact that the banking sector remains 100% Ethiopian. The idea of getting international firms to go in there when they can't deal with their own bank is something that's a deterrent not only to Western firms but also to Chinese firms. And the inefficiencies in the telecom sector also mean very difficult to do business. I mean, when I was there as envoy for Sudan, South Sudan, several times the internet was closed. Once because of the state of emergency, once ostensibly because the national university exams had been stolen. So the entire internet was shut down for days at a time. How do you process credit card transactions when the internet's shut down? How do you make airplane reservations? How do you make orders, conduct business?